core tube into the surface. We collected 2 different core tube samples. It was quite surprising the resistance that was met in this subsurface medium, and at the same time you see that it did not support very well the core tube as I was driving it into the surface.
This is a close, a double picture. It's actually a stereo picture of fine particulate material in the moon. This is taken from a glass, and the analysis of the cause for that characteristic is of extreme interest to the scientific community. Second picture taken with that scientific camera shows the nature of the clods of lunar surface material. And this picture shows the 80-foot crater, which that you observed earlier in the motion picture footage during the final phases of descent. We had very much hoped that this crater would be deep enough to show the lunar bedrock. It was about 15 or 20 feet deep, and although there are rocks in the bottom, there are no evidences on the inner walls of actually getting a picture or a view of the lunar bedrock.
We deposited several items on the lunar surface. I'm sure you're aware of these. One was a disk with 73 messages from nations of the world. There was a patch from Apollo 1 and various medals from the cosmonauts. We also elected as a crew to deposit a symbol which was representative of our patch, that is the U.S. Eagle carrying the olive branch to the lunar surface, and we thought it was appropriate to deposit this replica of the olive branch before we left.
This, after re-entering the LEM, we could see the effects of her in the area where the majority of the walking took place. However, in the left side of the picture where it is not as dark, there was also a good bit of walking, and so that indicates that the walking probably just increases your ability to notice the effects of the strange lighting that Buzz talked about earlier, where the cross-sun lighting is a good bit darker than the down sun.
Following the EVA, we had a sleep period, which, in a word, didn't go quite as well as we thought it might. We found it was quite difficult to keep warm when we pulled. Rather difficult for us to sleep. You see, mounted in the right-hand window, the 16-millimeter camera as it was mounted for taking the pictures on the surface. Following the sleep period, as we're approaching the liftoff point, we progressed with a gradual power-up of the lunar module, which included another star alignment up in front of the instrument panel. It was used to record the various messages that were sent up to us, the whole host of numbers for the particular maneuvers that were coming up that we would copy down. We'd log these on that sort of a data sheet.
This film shows our final look at Tranquility Base before our departure. And the ascent was a great pleasure. It was very smooth. We were very, very pleased to have that engine light up. Gave us an excellent view of our takeoff trajectory and tranquility base as we left, and at all times through the ascent we could pick up landmarks that assured us that we were on the proper track. There were no difficulties with the
particular out-of-plane maneuver that had been inserted between two other sequential maneuvers. In comparison with many simulator runs, we found that this was about as perfect a rendezvous as we could have asked for.
You've noted some oscillations in this film during ascent, and that's a real characteristic. The vehicle, due to the changing center of gravity as fuel is used, does a good bit of 5-degree oscillations throughout the ascent.
This is Eagle as seen by Columbia, or perhaps half an Eagle would be better, since the land... although we were far from home, we were a lot closer to it than the pure distance might indicate. Neil's making the initial maneuvers here to get turned around, and then again I do the final docking. This is somewhat swifter than real time. The probe, the dark funnel on the top of the LEM, and the docking target below it and to the left in the lighter portion of the LEM. As Buzz said, the rendezvous was absolutely beautiful. They came up from below absolutely as if they were riding on rails. There was absolutely no disturbance or any off-nominal effects during the last part of the rendezvous. Upper right, you can see the RCS quads, and down below the various...
At this relatively close range, it had a decided three-dimensional effect and was undoubtedly one of the most impressive sights of the flight. As we left the moon after a successful TEI, this is the view that we observed. I think that at least from where I sit here on the stage, the colors that you see there are quite close to being actually representative of the moon as seen from that distance. We were sorry to see the moon go, but we were certainly glad to see the Earth return. We used took a large number of photographs of the Earth on the way out and back, and had our wristwatches set on Houston time. An interesting use can be made of that. If you were looking at this picture and you looked at your watch and your watch said 7 o'clock in the evening, then you'd know that Houston is about 7 o'clock from the evening, and it's about an hour away from sunset, so it would be about 1/24th of an Earth's circumference away from the shadow, which is just about 15 degrees there. So at any time, by looking at a wristwatch and looking down at the Earth, we knew what was underneath the clouds, and it aided us in some ways in picking out what we should be seeing. We could see a large number of details on the Earth's surface, certainly all the continents and islands and details, many of which you followed perhaps in our discussions over the radio communications. But it was interesting to us to find out how well we could observe weather patterns on not only the worldwide scale, which you see here, but in specific localities. This particular shot does show the coast of North America, the equatorial cloud layers, what we think is probably intertropical.
We're ready now for question and answers, and wait for the microphone, and we'll go right down the line, and we'll catch everyone if you'll just be patient. Tom O'Toole.
How much time did you have left in your life support backpacks at the time you got back on board LEM?
I haven't seen the post-flight analysis of the numbers. We had roughly half of our available oxygen supply remaining in the backpacks, and somewhat less percentage in the water supplies, which is used for cooling. Of course, particularly on our first experience with the use of that backpack on the lunar surface, we were interested in conserving a good bit of margin in case we had difficulty with closing the hatch or repressurizing the LEM, or had any difficulties with getting the systems operating again in the normal fashion inside the cockpit.
Colonel Aldrin and Mr. Armstrong, when President Nixon made his phone call to you on the moon, it looked like the two of you suddenly stopped doing everything and stood there and listened and talked to him. It looked there for a moment like you might have been a little bit aware of what was going on. You weren't busy. Was there ever a moment on the moon when either one of you were just a little bit spellbound by what was going on?
About 2.5 hours.
I'd like to ask Neil Armstrong when he began to think of what he would say when he put his foot down on the lunar surface, and how long he pondered this statement about a small step for man, gigantic leap for mankind.
Yes, I did think about it. It was not extemporaneous, neither was it planned. It evolved during the conduct of the flight, and I decided what the words would be while we were on the lunar surface just prior to leaving the land.
I'd like to ask Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, and I'm not quite sure how to ask this question, but when you first stepped on the moon, did it strike you as you were stepping on a piece of the Earth, or sort of what your inner feelings were, whether you felt you were standing in a desert, or this was really another world, or how you felt at that point?
Well, there was no question in our minds where we were. We'd been orbiting around the moon for quite a while. At the same time, we have experienced 16G before. We've been exposed to some degree to the lighting that we saw. However, this was, in my case, an extremely foreign situation with the stark nature of the light and dark conditions. And of course, we first set foot on the moon in the dark, shadowy area.
How do you view space exploration as a relative priority compared with the pressing needs of the domestic society and the world community at large?
Well, of course, we all recognize that the world is continually to neglect any of those areas, and we certainly don't feel it's our place to neglect space exploration.
There was a lot of discussion during the flight, during the descent, power descent.
Operation. Now, I don't think that either the ground people or ourselves really anticipated that this would happen. It was not a serious program alarm. It just told us that for a brief instant the computer was reaching a point of being trying to solve these particular problems. We wanted to be able to look out the window to identify the features as they came up so that we would be able to pinpoint just where in the landing ellipse the computer was taking us.
Buzz was carrying on a rapid-fire conversation with the computer at that point, but I think we really have to give the credit to the control center in this case. They were the people that really came.
What your feelings are, is that perhaps the most difficult part of the mission, or are you looking forward to it?
Well, certainly the part that we're least prepared to handle.
Most important piece of advice or recommendation for the Apollo 12 crew.
more and more dexterity with arms moving and fingers moving. These things are under study. Of course, the Apollo 12 mission will have two different periods of EVA, one early in the mission and then a sleep period, and then another EVA following that. We've, in general, looked at their plans and talked to them about the duration. We talked to them about a brief period at the beginning of their EVA for their familiarization with the EVA, the 16G environment. I don't think we have any particular recommendations for how they should change their mission. It is a continuing evolvement of EVA capability and scientific exploration that they're undertaking on that flight.
You're now national heroes, and you've had a couple of weeks in isolation in the LRL to think about that. What are your initial feelings about being heroes? How do you believe it will change your lives? And do you think that maybe you'll get another chance to go to the moon, or are you going to be too busy being heroes?
Long preparing is that we had to prepare for Apollo 11. In the Lunar Receiving Laboratory, we did have very little time for meditation, it turns out. We were quite busy throughout the time period with the same sorts of things that the crews of past flights have done after their flights. The debriefing schedules and writing the pilot reports and getting all the facts down for use of all the people who will include that in the future flights, of course.
I'm struck from the movies and the still pictures by the difference in the very hostile appearance of the moon when you're orbiting over it or some distance from it, and the warmer colors and the apparently relatively more friendly appearance of it when you're on the surface. I'd like to ask Colonel Collins if he gets that same impression from the pictures, and the two of you who were on the moon, what impression you have along those lines.
Well, the moon changes character as the angle of sunlight striking its surface changes. At very low sun angles, close to the terminator, or dawn or at dusk, it has the harsh, forbidding characteristics which you see in a lot of the photographs. On the other hand, when the sun is more closely overhead, a midday situation, the moon takes on more of a brown color, it becomes almost a rosy-looking place, a fairly friendly place, so that from dawn through midday through dusk, you run the whole gamut of it. It starts off very forbidding, becomes friendly, and then becomes forbidding again as the sun dissipates.
Well, I think it requires some very pinpoint determination of the orbit that the vehicle is in before it begins powered descent, and this requires extreme care in this is what defines the error ellipse, where we might possibly land having targeted for the center. Now, the ability to be able to control where you are requires that you be able to identify features. And of course, in our particular of significant features as possible to give us as smooth a terrain. Now, in any area like this, there are always certain identifying features that you can come out, certain patterns or craters. And to the extent that this can be used, if the crew sees that they are not going exactly toward the pre-planned point, they can begin to...
and more on the landing, did at any time you consider an abort while you were getting the alarms and so forth?
Well, I safely do so. And as soon as program alarms, computer alarms manifest themselves, why you realize that you have a possible abort situation to contend with, but our procedure throughout...
The vehicle down in the same way that it was programmed to do. The only thing that was missing during this time period is that we did not have some of the displays on the computer keyboard, and we had to make several entries at this time in order to clear up that area.
would see to your private lives in the years ahead?
I wish I knew the answer.
But I think the landings of the type that are presently considered for the next number of flights are appropriate to the conclusions that we reached as a result of both our descent work and work on the surface. That we are able to investigate the variety of types of landing sites that they hope to accomplish.
I have two brief questions I'd like to ask, if I may. When you were carrying out that incredible moonwalk, did you find that the surface was equally firm anywhere, or were there harder and softer spots that you could detect? And secondly, when you looked up at the sky, could you actually see the stars and the solar corona in spite of the glare?
In rather flat regions, the footprint would penetrate perhaps a half an inch or sometimes only a quarter of an inch and gave a very firm response. In other regions near the edges of these craters, we could find that the foot would sink down maybe 2, 3, possibly 4 inches. And in the slope, of course, the various edges of the footprint might go on up to 6 or 7 inches, and compacting this material would tend to produce a slight sideways motion as it was compacted on the material underneath it. So we feel that you cannot always tell just by looking at the terrain what the exact resistance will be as your foot sinks into a point of firm contact. So one must be quite cautious in moving around in this rough terrain.
We were never able to see stars from the lunar surface or on the daylight side of the moon by eye without looking through the optics. I don't recall during the period of time that we were photographing the solar corona what stars we could see.
I don't remember seeing any.
Neil, you were a little bit concerned, you said, about stubbing your toe at the point of landing because the surface was obscured by dust. Do you see any way around that kind of problem for future landings on the moon?
I think the simulations that we have at the present time to enable a pilot to understanding the problems of a lunar landing, that is the simulator and the various lunar landing training facilities and trainers that we have will do that job sufficiently well. Above that, I think it's just a matter of pilot experience. And of course, the little bit of dispersions in the maneuvers, such as the DOI burn on the backside of the ignition, and there is no way of compensating until you get to final phase for that error.
Based on your own experience in space, do you or any of you feel that there will ever be an opportunity for a woman to become an astronaut in our space program?
Yes, I hope so.
I'd like to refer back to something that Neil Armstrong said a while back, that there was so much out there you would like to have done. As it was, you ended up a considerable number of minutes behind schedule. Is that because the schedule was overloaded for the EVA, or can we expect all astronauts, when they reach the moon for the first time, to enjoy themselves and spend as much time doing so as you seem to?
We plead guilty to enjoying ourselves. As Buzz mentioned earlier, we're recommending that we start future EVAs with a 15 or 20-minute period to get these kinds of things out of the way. Get used to the surface and what you see, adapt to the 16G and maneuvering around, and probably we just included a little more in the early phase than we were actually able to do.
Two questions. Where did the weird sounds, including the sirens and whistles, come from during the trans-Earth coast?
So much more pronounced.
This is for Mr. Armstrong. Had you planned to take over semi-manual control, or was it only